Thank you for coming to our Sky Island lecture series. This is the first in the series going until the second weekend in May. Our first talk is going to be by Jon Pelletier. He is professor at the university here in geosciences, and he will be talking about Hillslopes. There you go.
Thank you for coming to Flandrau today. My name is John. I'm a professor of geology, as Shiloh said, and my specialty in geology is geomorphology. So literally that means the shape of Earth. And so I'm interested in how river valleys form, how sand dunes migrate across the land, how coastlines change, that sort of thing. So today I'm going to focus on the geomorphology of the Santa Catalinas to complement the exhibit, the Sky Islands exhibit. So before I talk about geomorphology, let me just review why the Santa Catalina Mountains are a classic sky island. So this is a view of the Catalina Mountains from an aerial view. And what makes a sky island is that there's a strong difference in climate and also in vegetation between the lowest elevation down here at the Tucson basin, which is about 800 meters above sea level, and the highest elevation in the Santa Catalina Mountains, which is about 2,000 meters higher. That difference in climate is things are cooler up there, of course, and there's also more rainfall. And the change in rainfall is really extreme. So at the bottom, we've got about 25 centimeters mean annual precipitation. And up at the top, it's about 4 times higher, so almost a meter of precipitation per year. So what that means, that change in climate as a function of elevation, means that different vegetation can grow at different elevations. And so there are distinct life zones as you go up in elevation. So that's the classic idea of a sky islands. The idea is that the forest, which can grow above about 2,000 meters above sea level up to the highest elevations, that forest needs a certain amount of precipitation to grow, and we get that precipitation at high elevations only, and so that's the island within the sea of the desert floor around it. So that concept is shown in this graph. Basically, at low elevation, we have the desert scrub vegetation type of the Sonoran Desert. And then we go into the oak woodland, the ponderosa pine woodland, and the mixed conifer woodland at the highest elevation. So each of those have distinct zones as we go up in elevation. Scientists call these things gradients. So a gradient is just a change in something, in this case as a function of elevation. As we go up in elevation, we're seeing differences in climate, particularly mean annual precipitation, and we're seeing differences in vegetation type and also the amount of vegetation, the total biomass on the landscape. And so this is what makes a sky island a sky island. Now there is one more wrinkle in the story, and that wrinkle has to do with the shape of where the hill slopes are pointed. So on the north-facing side of the Catalina Mountains, the forest occurs at a lower elevation than it does on the south-facing side. So on the north-facing side, we have forest at a lower elevation on the south-facing side. This is a complicated diagram, but it breaks these things out. And again, it's showing the fact that on the north-facing side, to the left-hand side of this image, this graph, the vegetation types are shifted downward in elevation compared to the south-facing side. Does anybody know why that difference in slope aspect exists? Any ideas? Yeah, the south-facing slopes are too dry. So the basic idea is that we have precipitation coming down on the landscape. Plants of a certain type need a certain amount of water. So if we think about the tree line at 2,000 meters, they require a certain amount of water that's much more than what we see down here in the desert floor. And and on the south-facing side, some of that water that comes down on the landscape is irradiated off. So evaporation is one of the ways that soil gets pulled out of, or water gets pulled out of the soil. And the evaporation is a function of temperature, and it's a function of the incident solar radiation. So in the south-facing slope, they get more solar radiation, they're a little bit warmer, the evaporation rates are higher, so the amount of rainfall coming down in the landscape is about the same between north and south, but the amount of stuff that's lost through evaporation is much higher on the south-facing side and much lower on the north-facing side, meaning that there's more water available to be used by plants on the north-facing side. So in a water-limited environment like this, the trees can grow at lower elevation. Or another way of thinking about it is that at a single elevation, there's more biomass on the north-facing side than there is on the south-facing side. So it's a combination of elevation and what we call slope aspect, the direction where the slope is pointed, that controls vegetation. Now, less well known is the fact that there's also a gradient in rock type. So the rock type at low elevation is different from the rock type at higher elevation. And so that's what I want today, is I want to talk about rock type primarily and how that influences the morphology of river canyons and hill slopes. So that's getting more to my area. Geology is a bunch of different subfields. I'm interested in climate. Climate affects geomorphology. But in this particular case, rock type is the big story. So if you've ever driven up the Catalina Highway, and I'm sure most of you have, then at the low elevation, you see rock that is highly heterogeneous. It's broken up, and it also alternates between strong bands. These bands have a different mineralogical composition. Okay, they have more quartz in them than the bands that are darker. So there's an alternating series of light and dark bands. These are two different types of rocks. They're both granitic rocks, but they have different ages. And their history means that the darker colored rocks are weaker. They're more susceptible to erosion than the lighter colored rocks. And so in the lower part of the Catalina Mountains, we have strong and weak zones, okay? And those strong and weak zones have joints that have fractured them up. So we have these vertically oriented joints, and those vertically oriented joints tell us about the tectonic history of the Santa Catalina Mountains. And they're also important for folks like me who study river canyons, because the rivers, the water and the sediment that's coming down from the mountains, can exploit and take advantage of those weak zones. So what we've done in the Catalinas is to show that these white bands have a lower joint density. So they don't have as many joints per square meter as the darker bands. And the rivers can get hung up on the strong bands and form waterfalls. And on the weaker bands, they can carve more readily. So I'm going to show you in just a second a profile of a river, and that profile is very irregular down low in the Catalinas, and that reflects the type of rocks that we see there, these very heterogeneous rocks. As you go up higher in the Catalinas, you see more granite. Okay, so the rocks are not as metamorphosed. They haven't been experiencing the same pressure and temperature, high temperature and pressure variations as the southern part of the Catalinas. And the rocks are not as banded. They're more homogeneous, okay? And that has important implications for geomorphology. So at the low elevation, I want you to think about irregular, banded, jointed rock. And at the higher elevations, they're more massive, and they're more homogeneous. So the reason why the rock type is a function of elevation has to do with the history of how the Catalina Mountains were formed. They were pulled apart, and I should say I'm not an expert on this problem. George Davis, who'll be here in just a couple of weeks as part of this lecture series, is the expert. He worked out the story of the tectonic history of the Catalina Mountains, and so I encourage you to come back if you're available to do so. But the basic idea is that the Catalina Mountains were pulled apart. And so the way that we think about this is two hands that are pulling the crust apart. It wasn't quite like that because it wasn't an external force that was pulling things apart. It turns out that the history is more of the mountains being compressed because there was a subducting plate off the coast of western North America. And when that plate shifted to create the San Andreas Fault, that compressive force went away, and that created effectively an extension, like the rocks were being pulled apart. What that means is that in terms of the geology, the rocks that are at the highest part of the Catalina Mountains are relatively undeformed granite rock that haven't experienced the same kind of shearing forces that have been experienced by rocks that are at the edge of the Catalina Mountains. So down here on the southern flank, the low elevation, what we get is jointed, banded rocks, very, very heterogeneous, because they've been through the ringer. They've been really twisted and deformed and sheared and pulled, unlike the rocks in the center or the core of the range, which are found at higher elevation. So it's that gradient in rock type that I'd like to talk about today, and its implications for geomorphology. So tectonic extension produces sheared, banded rocks at low elevations, particularly on the south side of the range, and relatively undeformed or homogeneous rocks at high elevations. And this is our geologic map that shows a lot of these banded rocks at low elevation transitioning to more undeformed rocks at higher elevation. So if we were to make if we were to walk from the highest point of the Catalinas down south, or if you prefer, if you want the exercise, you can walk from the lowest point of the Catalinas all the way up to the top. This is the path along which you would walk. So this is what scientists call a longitudinal profile. A longitudinal profile is how you walk along a river valley. Now river valleys are, they have bends and they have very tortuous paths. But imagine you just stretch that out into a single line and you plotted the elevation above sea level in this case, and as a function of the distance down the river valley. Now water goes downhill, and so if you're following the river valley, you're going to continuously go downhill. And this is what we would expect to see. This is this typical longitudinal profile found around the world in many, many locations. There are exceptions, and the Catalinas are one of them. But this is a longitudinal profile that's exactly what we'd expect to see, because at the highest elevations of the Catalina Mountains, we don't have any big rivers. We have small rivers. We're close to the divide. We're close to the highest point where water is dissected between going to the, from one basin to another, from draining towards Oracle to draining towards Tucson. Up there, at the highest elevations, there's just not a lot of water. There's water coming down, but it hasn't focused into large river valleys yet. So when you're up close to the highest point of a mountain, you need a lot of slope to carve into bedrock because you don't have a lot of drainage area. You don't have a lot of water. So there's an inverse relationship between drainage area and slope. This is the typical form of a river valley, a longitudinal profile of a river valley. And so what this means is that we have a concave profile. That is a profile that loses slope. The slope goes down as you increase in the distance from where you started. Okay? This concave river profile is the typical case. Now let me contrast this with a cross-section, a longitudinal profile through Molino Canyon. So this is the canyon you drive up when you're going up Catalina Highway before you get to Molino Basin. It's the first 5 miles of the highway. This is a very different profile, right? So this profile is got a couple of things that make it distinct from the classic profile I just showed you. One of the things that makes it distinct is the fact that it has an overall convex form. It's steepening as a function of distance, which is a little strange. And also, and what I'll focus on a bit more, is the fact that it has these jumps, right? It has these discontinuities where, the stream's going along and then it just, boom, it goes vertical, okay? And this is a longitudinal profile that covers 1,300 feet in elevation, okay? So some of these steps in the topography are really significant. They're 30, 40 meters or something like 100 feet. These are the big waterfalls of the Catalina Mountains. So I want to talk about the relationship between the banding and these bumps in the topography. So what do these bumps look like? Not in the data, not in a graph, but out in the real world. Well, if you've ever been to Seven Falls looks like this. This is a tributary to Bear Creek, and it's a stair-step pattern. There are zones where things get very, very steep, okay, like right through here, and we get what we call a waterfall or a cataract. If it's dry, we typically call it a cataract. And what's happening in these zones is that we've got an unusually strong band of this whiter granite, okay, exposed. So the rocks of the southern low elevation portion of the Catalinas, they're banded, and they have thick bands and thin bands, and they range all over the place. But when the river has to encounter a thick band, and that band doesn't have a lot of weaknesses to start with, we're only talking about water. We have to carve through that rock somehow. And there are a couple of mechanisms that rivers use to carve through bedrock, okay? When it encounters a strong zone, like this zone right here, this very strong band, then there's really only one mechanism it can use. It uses abrasion by sand, okay? So basically, this water is coming down in flood. It's maybe 1 meter or 2 meters high. It's not 10 meters or 100 meters. It has a range of depths. It depends on the meteorological conditions, but you can only get so much water falling from the sky at any given point in time. And so these rivers have, 1 to 2 meters of flow depth. And when they encounter a big, strong chunk of rock, They can't pick that material up. They can't pull it out. They have to carve it in place. And so the way that they do that is they take the sand and gravel from upslope, and they focus the water and the sand, and they create a very narrow slot canyon. So here's an example on the right-hand side. When you see these things, they typically have undulating walls. They're very narrow. I mean, this is about a meter wide. So you've got a pretty large drainage basin, and all that water is being focused into a very narrow point because you need to focus that sand and gravel and get it moving at very high speed in order to carve through in order to carve through that rock. So what you see is smooth walled canyons, and this is a characteristic of the abrasion process. So sand that's moving in the water column is slowly chipping away at the sides of the rock, of the sides of the channel. And so in order to carve down, it needs to use sand, and it needs to really focus down and become very narrow. So abrasion is one process by which water and rivers can carve down into bedrock. And this is what they tend to do when the joints are very widely spaced, when the density of joints is very low. And this is typically the case in these places where the river gets hung up, places like Seven Falls. The other mechanism that it can use in places where the joint density is relatively large, okay, so the spacing between individual joints is 1 meter or 2 meters. In that case, the depth of the water is comparable to the size of the material it's trying to move, and during a very large flood, one that occurs maybe every 100 years or every several hundred years, it can pick up one of those blocks of bedrock and move them. And these blocks of bedrock are continually being winnowed away, made smaller. They develop weaknesses over time just because they're exposed to the elements through the processes of weathering. So rock, when it's near the surface, tends to break down into material that can be transported. So here's an example of a river channel. It's coming at us. It's coming out of the board. This is a river channel that doesn't have an undulating wall. It doesn't have smooth edges, like if you took sandpaper to it. It doesn't have that kind of a shape to it. Instead, it's got a jointed bed, and it's irregular. And it looks like basically the river every once in a while is able to pluck out one of these weak zones and is able to pick one up. Like maybe the last one to get plucked out of the riverbed was this one right here. So there was a missing piece of rock right there, and that missing piece of rock had irregularities, joints, that were pre-existing from the tectonic history. Now another form of bumpiness or irregularity that we see in the Catalina Mountains has to do with the way that the river changes direction. So I've been talking about the longitudinal profile, which is the change in elevation with distance. But let's forget about elevation entirely. Let's just look at a bird's eye view and see how the river is changing direction. This is Soldier Canyon. Soldier Canyon comes down, it travels to the the west-southwest, and then it goes 90 degrees. It takes a 90-degree left-hand turn, right? 90-degree left-hand turn, and it goes to the south-southeast. And then it goes again to the west-southwest, and then it goes again, and it sort of jogs up, and then it goes around, and then it goes this way, and it follows exactly the same orientation it did up here, almost exactly the same orientation. And then it goes back down to the west-southwest. So this is very unusual. Rivers meander, for sure, but they typically don't have 90-degree turns, and they typically don't follow two distinct orientations. In this case, the two distinct orientations are to the west-southwest and to the south-southeast. So we have two directions that are almost perpendicular to one another, and the river wants to go in these two directions. And this is what it looks like in the field. So over here, the river's coming down this way, and then it's taking a 90-degree turn, 90-degray left-hand turn to go that direction. And this is one of the 90-degree angles that this upper Soldier Canyon takes in its pathway to the Tucson Basin. So what's going on here? Well, if you go out with your Brunton compass, okay, which tells you the orientation of these vertically oriented joints, these pre-existing fractures, which the river is able to exploit and take advantage of, if you go out there with your compass, you can measure the orientations of these vertically oriented joints. And these vertically oriented joints have two characteristic directions. They're almost perpendicular to one another. And one of the characteristic joints, so this is just a visualization of how many joints are pointed in this direction within a set of populations from a local area. So we go out and we measure several hundred joint directions, and we find that most of them are oriented along two directions. One direction is to the west-southwest, another direction is to the south-southeast. And so this is pretty consistent along this whole field area. We can go in and study individual reaches of the river, and we find that the river is orienting itself along the directions of these pre-existing fractures, these joints, okay? Now I'll tell you in just a sec why it's important, why these two directions are important. Why don't joints form north-south or east-west? What's special about this particular direction and this particular direction? Well, the answer is that when this pulling apart of the crust took place, all right, what happened was that pulling apart of the crust was along this direction. So along this direction, this is the direction of extension. This is that primary direction, that west-southwest direction. The crust was being pulled apart. So the tectonic forces in the area had created a large plateau, and this is, 30 million years ago, had created a large plateau to the north, and the crust was being pulled apart, and the extension was pulling the Tucson Mountains away from the top of the Catalina Mountains. The Tucson Mountains used to be on top of the Catalinas, but all this stretching pulled the Tucson Mountains off to the west-southwest, and that's where they sit today. So the directions are important here because they indicate the direction of extension where the rocks were pulled apart. And this is kind of cool, this 90-degree change in the rivers, but this is at a pretty small scale. So I don't actually have a scale map on here, but this is something like 1 kilometer of the river. It's not a very large portion. This is the entire Catalina Mountains, this whole thing. And what we tend to find when we look at the canyons that are emanating from the southern flank of the Catalina Mountains is that they tend to have these two characteristic directions. Even the really, really big canyons are controlled by these joints. For example, Pima Canyon right here has a very unusual shape to it. The Catalina Mountains were uplifted. The highest point is here. One would expect the water to flow downhill along the steepest path to get to the Tucson Basin. The steepest path is roughly in this direction. It's basically to the south, or maybe a little bit west of south. And that's true over here and over here. But instead we have these rivers that are deflected strongly along the direction of extension. Okay? And this has been a mystery for a while. I don't know if I have the answer, but one answer at least is that these rivers appear to be exploiting these joint sets, which have characteristic directions that are controlled by the initial tectonic pull apart many millions of years ago. So these river canyons tend to be oriented either, most of them are oriented along the west-southwest direction, but you also have some examples like Ventana here, which is to the southeast. Okay, so the two characteristic directions are west-southwest and then south-southeast. And then you go over here, Sabino and Bear are both classic examples of that west-southwest direction. Now we're scientists, so this is a reasonable conceptual model. What we try to do is go to places where the variable that we're trying to understand varies, and we can test our hypothesis. So in this case, the hypothesis is that the river channel is exploiting the joint set, and so there's a correlation. We would predict a correlation between the joint orientations that we measure in the field with our Brunton compass versus the orientation of the canyon, which is at a much larger scale. The joints are human scale, the canyons are kilometer scale. They're bigger than that. So what we would expect to find is that as we go around and we see small variations in these joint sets, so places where they're not following exactly the same direction as the regional mountain belt, places where they're a little bit more south of west-southwest, they're more like south-southwest, what we see is that the canyons are starting to become oriented preferentially along those directions. So we think we have a good hypothesis. This is a way to test it, because where we see variations in joint sets, the canyon orientations are following suit pretty well, one-to-one. We can also play computer models. So computer models basically allow us to sort of play God and say, what if we had the uplift scenario that we expected for the Catalinas, but we didn't have the joints? How would things work? Now, models make assumptions, so they're not as good as nature, for sure, but they allow us to test some hypotheses. So here's the real Catalina Mountains here, just expressed as a grayscale map, where white or lighter color is higher elevation and black is lower elevation. And so in this case, this is an example of the uplift of the Catalina Mountains. This is what we would expect the drainages to look like. I'm not predicting exactly where the canyons should sit, but I'm predicting statistically what the orientation should look like, given the uplift history of the Catalina Mountains that we've been able to work out geologically, but without the joints. So I'm not including the joints. This is a simulation that includes the uplift history plus the presence of joints. And so here, the orientation of the canyons is a little bit stronger than what we see in nature. It's a little bit more extreme. But the basic idea, one of the ways that we build confidence in this hypothesis is to test computer models that have joints and ones that don't. And the ones that have joints appear to be more statistically similar to the actual orientations that we see in nature. Now, I just have a few more slides. I want to talk a little bit about the bumps on the hill slopes. So I've been focused entirely on the river bottoms, right, the channels. And so when we go up on the hill slopes, we see a similar kind of stair-step topography. So in Seven Falls, we saw those stair steps. We saw pools alternating with cataracts, and then pools and cataracts. And that's because the pools are forming in the relatively weak rock, and the vertical cataracts, the waterfalls, are forming in the relatively strong rock. Well, we have a similar kind of banding on the hill slopes. So here's an example of a relatively unjointed, big, thick, unjointed, strong band right here. And this forms a vertical cliff. So this is about milepost 4 in the Catalina Mountains. If you look off to the right, you can see this banding really, really well on the hill slopes. And so we've got a nice vertical cliff here. And then as you get into the weaker rocks, and you can dig down into the subsurface, and you can see that you're looking at that blacker type of granitic rock, okay? You're looking at the older oracle granite as opposed to the younger wilderness granite. And what you find is that there's a wedge of soil and sediment that is deposited upon the weaker rock. And then we go back into the stronger rock. So we've got another cliff-forming unit up here, another resistant rock, and that forms the cliff. And then we have another wedge of sediment, and this sequence continues up on the hill slope. So we also see periodic or semi-periodic variations in the slope and the soil cover on the hill slopes that we also think reflects the heterogeneity of the underlying rock. So the basic idea is that strong bands resist weathering. They resist the breakdown to soil. And one of the ways they do that is through their mineralogy. There are certain minerals that are resistant to weathering. And another way they do that is by having a low joint density. If you don't have as many surfaces on your rock when it's exposed, if you have a massive rock that doesn't have a lot of joints in it, there's not a lot of room to do chemical reactions and physical reactions that break down rock. So rock that starts off heavily fractured has more surface area. It's going to weather faster, simply for that reason as well. The weak bands erode more quickly, and they develop a soil cover. So basically, there's a rate of soil production, and there's a rate of erosion. And the two things together in balance tell you whether you store soil, and if the rate of soil production is high, you're going to store soil on these benches. And if the rate of soil production is low, you're going to get rid of all the soil that's there, and you're going to form a vertical cliff. The conceptual model here is that there's a relationship between soil production. So I also want to talk about the concept of a feedback. We think we have a positive feedback at work in this system. Positive feedback means that we have two processes that are working in concert to accelerate one another to go towards one end state. And so the feedback here is that soil thickness and erosion work hand in hand. The basic idea is that if you have a rock that's relatively strong, that doesn't have a lot of joints in it, then that rock is going to weather into soil more slowly, and erosion is going to take away that material. Well, if you don't have any soil cover on the rock, then you're not going to store water, you're not going to grow plants. And if you don't store water and you don't grow plants, it's even harder to break down that rock into soil, because water is a catalyst for weathering. You need water to do all kinds of breakdown processes. One of them is freeze and thaw. when you put water into the cracks of a rock, when that water freezes, it expands by 8%. It produces huge pressures, and those pressures can fracture the rock in place. That's one of the mechanisms that is used to create soil by nature. And so what we have are these zones where there's no water being stored, there's no vegetation. That lowers the soil production rate even more. So we think that some portions of the Catalina Mountains are sitting on this portion of what we call a humped production function. A humped production function means that when the soil gets very, very thick, the soil production at the base, at bedrock, goes down because we have all the soil cover on top. That's protecting the underlying bedrock from the elements. And also, when we go down to very, very thin soils, we're not supporting vegetation and we don't have water storage. For that reason, we think the soil production goes down. So the landscape gets bisected essentially into two different states. One is a relatively thick state that has a concave profile, and the other one is a relatively thin soil case that has a convex profile. And so as you're driving up the Catalina Mountains, I think you can see that pretty well. This is the convex profile, this is concave, convex, concave, convex, concave. Okay? So I just have a couple more slides. The longitudinal profile data that I showed you before comes from what we call airborne LiDAR data. So there's been a revolution in my field in the last 10 or 20 years towards using airplanes to shoot lasers down on the ground. And I thought there might be some kids in the audience, so I was going to talk about lasers, right? So we think that, so what happens is we've got an airplane, and the airplane has a very high quality GPS that tells it exactly where it is in space. We shoot that laser beam down on the ground, and it comes back and it tells us exactly the distance to the ground to very high accuracy, just a few centimeters. So this airborne LiDAR is shooting laser beams down at 50,000 points per second and is recording the distance coming back up. So we have remarkably good maps now of the Catalina Mountain topography and vegetation that we didn't have just a few years ago. So for example, this is just a map of the Catalina Mountains at high elevation. So I'm showing a portion just near, this is up towards the top of the mountain near Mount Lemmon. So this is the U of A Sky Center, okay? This is the ski valley right here, which you can see really well. So the lower map is the canopy height, right? So where you see trees, right, you can actually see individual trees. And I'm not even showing the highest quality of this data. So you're mapping individual trees on the landscape. You can see the height of the tree, how much it's spaced from its neighbors, those kinds of things. And so where you see these chutes, these are places where the landscape is, the trees have been removed to make way for ski runs. There's also, you can see the fact that there's more trees on the north-facing slope, which is this one here, than there is on the south-facing slope. Again, coming back to that idea that the orientation of the slope controls how much vegetation it can support. Even high up in the Catalina Mountains, that's really important. So this airborne LiDAR data is a new technology, really exciting, and we can go back and refly areas, look at vegetation change, look at debris flows that have occurred. I also just want to show a couple more slides. I'm interested in the Catalina Mountains. I also work on a bunch of other systems. I'm very excited about science. And so one of the things I work on with a ground-based laser station is the motion of sand dunes. So here's a sand dune. This particular example is from the Salton Sea area. And so this is a dune field that I've been monitoring for several years. And when we take those lasers and bring them down to the ground, we can get very high resolution maps. We can see individual ripples on the surface. So these models for topography are 1 centimeter in resolution when you're doing this kind of technology from the ground. And you can go back multiple times and see how these dune fields have evolved. And I have numerical models that try to reproduce how the ripples in the dunes evolve. I'm also interested in the evolution of Grand Canyon. I'm the state geomorphologist, or one of the state geomorphologists. And so here's a computer model of the evolution of Grand Canyon. And I'd be happy to talk about, with anyone about this work later. I also do work on Mars a little bit. It's helpful because when you study the Earth and you look at what's happening on Mars, you get a sense for how differences in gravity and differences in atmospheric pressure control processes that we see on both planets. So this, for example, is just a debris flow. We're sitting in a canyon wall here, a crater wall, and this is just a movie showing, it's running over and over again, just showing a particularly famous debris flow that occurred several years ago, and one that was debated about whether it had water in it or not. So there was a debate about whether this was a dry debris flow or a wet debris flow, whether there was evidence for liquid water on Mars. And so some of my work also goes to the red planet, which I think is exciting. So thank you for listening. I'd be happy to take any questions either now or one-on-one after the talk. Thank you. Any questions?
I'm kind of interested in the Grand Canyon. Such a big scope and length of time. You know, the erosion processes such as that. So it's interesting a little bit that you did talk about it. It's fun for me to hear.
Yeah, so in the case of the Grand Canyon, I'm not sure that this is going to, yeah, I can get this thing to go again. So, you know, there's a lot, I mean, you know, I could lecture for at least an hour on this problem, but it's not dissimilar from what we talked about in the Catalinas in the sense that the processes of abrasion and plucking are at work here. And here we think that plucking is more important because the rocks of the, well, it depends on what you're trying to work through. So when you're trying to work through that red wall limestone, that's a really thick, undeformed, low joint density system. And so when the river has to go through the red wall limestone, it actually forms a bench. And if you've ever been down the Grand Canyon, you can see a really nice bench that forms basically just a place of flat topography where the river had a difficult time. And even now, as the slopes are retreating, they're retreating by weathering. And then once that material starts to weaken, you can get slope failures, and that brings material down to the river bottom. And then the river has to rework all that debris that came from the slopes. So there is a dance. There is a relationship between the sediment that's coming down from the hill slopes. The hill slope gradient, how steep they are, is controlled by how fast the river is coming down. And so we've been arguing about the Grand Canyon for a long time. And one of the ways to understand it is to put it into a computer model using the best quantitative model we have for this plucking process and this slope failure process, and put them together so that they can interact. And it's that interaction that we're starting to do, you know, more and more nowadays in geomorphology, using numerical models. But we also, you know, we need to go in the field and we need to date things and figure out rates of overall rates, because the computer models don't tell us rates. They tell us the style of how things evolved, but we always have to calibrate against real geologic data, things that have been absolutely dated radiometrically with things like radiocarbon and other methods, to tell us, you know, how fast things are occurring. So this particular model makes certain, it tested a certain set of initial conditions for how the Grand Canyon formed and how old it is. And so if you invite me back, then I'll give a talk on that.
So in your model, so do you assume the water is a major force, so that the wind and sunshine don't play any role?
Well, in this particular Grand Canyon model, the sunshine plays a role through the weathering of rock. So we don't get into the details of, I don't actually measure the solar radiation on every rock, you know, as it passes through the year. But solar radiation is a controlling factor for the rate of weathering. What we do is we know some things about how the rate of weathering varies by looking at the geologic record. So for example, there are caves in the red wall limestone. The red wall limestone is the most resistant unit in the stratigraphy of Grand Canyon. So in that red wall limestone, there are caves and there are deposits of pack rats. So the pack rats eat what's around them and they deposit their feces in these caves. And there's a relationship between the age of the pack rat midden and the distance from the wall, from where the cave begins. And it turns out that you can take this data and you can infer the rate of retreat. So the processes that are involved in the breakdown of rock include things like solar radiation, but we don't know enough about how climate has changed going back in the past, especially the details like, you know, the temperature in July 15,000 years ago. We don't have that kind of data, but we can say that we've gone into the geologic record, and we've been able to say that over tens of thousands of years, even though we don't know the detailed climate, we know that this rock has retreated by 100 meters. And then we do make some extrapolations about bringing that out to the 6 million year history of the Grand Canyon. So there are some extrapolations involved in that, and it's something that we're trying to get better and better at all the time. But but in the canyon itself, we do assume that the movement of water plucking rock out of the base is the primary mechanism. But we can switch to an abrasion model when we get into those really resistant units like the red wall limestone, because there's nothing to pluck, basically. You're either going to dissolve it because it's a limestone, so one way to get rid of it is to dissolve it, but that happens more slowly than what nature is telling us is happening. Instead, we do that abrasion process. So the same switch between abrasion and plucking we also see in the Grand Canyon as well, and it's important for the history.
The other thing is, so in model you assume all the water flow, the water flow is always constant. So do you see, based on the model, you see in the Earth's history, such as let's say 10,000 years ago, there's less water now or more water?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in this case, we do assume that the water is constant. We know that that's not true in detail. The problem is that it's we can say something in the climate about how wet things were on average. So we know that it was wetter 18,000 years ago. We have good evidence of that. But whether that was more water in big storms or whether there was just more storms that didn't do any geologic work, So for example, you may just have this water, when it rains like Seattle gets, mist every day, so there's a lot of water, but it's not coming down in a way that's geomorphically effective in terms of, these big floods. So there is some data that's, getting at this issue of the most extreme floods that do most of the work, but we don't have a lot of data on that. I think we can still say things that are important about the history of Grand Canyon, but you're right that that's an uncertainty that translates into some uncertainty about the model results. Thank you.
Is there any evidence for initial fissure in the Grand Canyon area and then it broadening out from that? Or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think so. That's a challenge of geomorphology because you're studying things that are gone. The evidence is in the Sea of Cortez at some level. All the detritus has been removed from the canyon. There is some likelihood that along the Kaibab monocline. So the Kaibab is this thing right here, and what we tend to see around the Colorado Plateau is that when you have rocks that have been bent in the form of anticlines, so the rocks have been folded upward, you tend to see that there are canyons that have been formed where the rock has been bent. So the Kaibab is a monocline or an anticline where the rocks are severely deformed along the eastern edge, and then it snakes around. And so it's quite possible that the river chose the course it did based upon the fact that the rocks were heavily deformed, they had a lot of joints in them, they were more weatherable than the rocks around them. So I hope I'm trying to make this clear that along the eastern edge of the Kaibab, this is where the rocks are relatively undeformed at the top of the Kaibab, and then along the eastern edge, they undergo a lot of curvature. They've been heavily deformed. And so that's one example, I think, of what you're talking about. It's not the case that there was a canyon already there, although there may have been. But it's certainly the case that, I think it's the case that the rocks were more easily eroded along this edge because the rocks were more bent. They were more deformed along that edge. So that kind of thing does occur, and I think the Kaibab, eastern edge of the Kaibab monocline, and the fact that the river wraps around this thing, it's basically trying to hug this area where the rocks were more easily eroded. Yeah. All right, thanks very much.